Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. My name is Jo Kreiter, and I am a choreographer and site artist based in San Francisco, and it's lovely to be a guest of the CAC for this conversation. This is now our 9th Intersector, Conversations in Art, Action, and Policy. And I'm really especially excited to be here today with two amazing people who have tremendous expertise in restorative justice. So I'm really happy to introduce to you Troi Bechet, who is the founder and CEO of the Center for Restorative Approaches. Prior to her work with CRA, she worked as the Director of Community Building Initiative at Neighborhood Housing Services, and she also served as the Director of the New Orleans Theater Association. So she and I have some performing arts mojo in common. She was also the Vice President of Operations at the Private Industry Council of New Orleans. So welcome, Troi. And we also have Lauren Trout. Lauren identifies as she, them, and is a queer Native Southerner, restorative justice practitioner, facilitator, trainer, speaker, and consultant. They use restorative theory as a tool for people, communities, and institutions to shift paradigms of justice and embed restorative justice values, tenets, and guiding principles into their organizational culture and larger systems and infrastructure. So welcome, Lauren. It's great to have both of you. So I start this conversation as someone who is making a trilogy of dances called the Decarceration Trilogy, Dismantling the Prison Industrial Complex One Dance at a Time. And while the first in the trilogy is coming to New Orleans in September, it's called The Wait Room, the third in the trilogy, which I'm currently working on, really centers restorative justice as an alternative to incarceration. So as we begin the conversation, I'd like to ask you, can you tell us first what restorative justice is for you? And what is its relationship to prison abolition? Yeah, that's the starting question.
Go ahead, Troi.
Oh, thank you, Lauren. um, well, I think the restorative justice to me is a subset of restorative approaches, and I know Lauren and I have a little bit of a difference in regards to that. Restorative approaches for me is really about building, nurturing, and repairing relationships. And restorative justice tends to focus more on the reparation end. If my goal would be to use restorative justice processes as often and as early as possible, meaning as early as pre-arrest, i.e. something happens in the community, rather than having that person arrested for committing this offense, if that person, the responsible party, and the survivors of that crime, whatever it might be, whether a home was burglarized or a store was robbed, whatever that offense is, if those parties that are impacted by it decide that they would prefer to use a system of justice that is focused on reparation and healing as opposed to punishment, then that could be done as early as pre-arrest. Lauren?
Thanks, Troi. Yeah, I would love to add to that and say, for me, restorative justice is a theory of justice. It's a philosophy with guiding principles. It is a theory with processes attached to it. And I would also say that restorative justice, as we're seeing it now, is a social movement, right? In its history, it's been a set of indigenous practices. It's been like a social service from the justice system. It's been a theory, and now we're seeing it evolve into a bit of a social movement, I would say, in the last year since the murder of George Floyd. And so for me, I would just say, hopefully quickly, that to talk about restorative justice in relationship to like abolition and decarceration is really unpacking about what restorative justice is as a rethinking of justice. And to me, we have to, like, to do that, we have to also talk about unpacking our society's idea of justice, right? Because like we have been socialized or conditioned to understand our society's idea of justice as like all encompassing, or like really like objective ultimately. But really, our society's idea of justice is one particular paradigm or belief system of what justice is, that a small group of people created, that is historically rooted in like puritanical capitalist white supremacy, right? So like our society's idea of justice, and the definition of justice centers the state, and white concepts of like laws and punishment and individualism and property. And so in that regard, it's like, it's incorrect to say that our justice system is broken, because like, that's exactly what we're getting, right? You know, it's that idea that like systems are perfectly designed to get the results that they get. And so when we are talking about restorative justice, we're really saying like, we need to rethink about what justice is. We need to redefine what justice is, where it comes from, how we get it. And we need to orient to a different set of principles and values, right? It's a rethinking of like, who gets to make decisions and how we define healing, how we define accountability, even how power is held. And so when we're really moving restorative justice's guiding principles and tenets and values into our ideas of justice, and I'll say this one last thing, that we're also looking at, you know, crime and harm institutionally, not just interpersonally, right? Acknowledging that like society has ideologies and policies and practices and institutions that have either caused harm or created conditions for harm. And that if we're really going to look at harm differently, we need to like acknowledge all levels of harm. I think if we're thinking about those restorative justice in that way, restorative justice is an incredible tool for abolition and creating something different.
Thank you, Lauren, for the breadth and historical scope. I just think of, there's a book written by a man named Zach Norris, who is executive director of the Ella Baker Center here in Oakland. And he wrote a book called Defund Fear. And he talks about the harm from not knowing if you're going to be able to pay your utility bill or not, or the harm of having to choose between paying your rent versus your you know, school field trip fee for your child. So I love the idea of reframing what harm is and pulling in an economic lens. And then Troi, when you were talking about pre-arrest, I really want to ground what you were saying in my own experience, which is that my partner was arrested by the FBI, and I did develop a small relationship with the person from the FBI. It was a woman who was in charge of his case. And, you know, I said to her, you know, they had been watching our home, et cetera. I'm not going to go into details, but I said to her, if you knew this was going on, why did you have to wait and build a case? Why couldn't you just, you know, knock on our door and say, something's wrong here, let's fix it, you know? And she could not fathom the possibility that there was an alternative to what transpired. So yeah, I really am grateful that you two are out there making that cultural and ideological change happen, like at a really, you know, hardcore, you know, in the system level. My next question is about the concepts of restorative and transformative justice. I hear it said that restorative justice processes have been co-opted, and I'm wondering if you can speak to your experience of that, and or if you can talk about transformative justice and how that is and is not the same as restorative justice.
I'm happy to start, mostly, as somebody who's learning about transformative justice, and certainly no expert. My information might be a little brief. But I think it's exactly, to what we were speaking to before, is that there has often been criticism of restorative justice when people, practitioners or theorists, or RJ adjacent folks, aren't thinking about the systems that cause harm, or at least create the conditions for harm, for interpersonal harm. And so, restorative or transformative justice really kind of like builds off the ground that restorative justice has been sowing, and says like, yes, thank you so much. And why would we want to restore back to something that was harmful in the first place, right? And so, my understanding is that of transformative justice is that it is equally like, also a theory and a series of processes, and a visioning of something different. And that says like, we, when addressing harm, we are also working to ensure that that harm doesn't happen again, and through systemic larger levels. So it's got like short end and long-term goals to it. And I believe with restorative justice, there's also a refusal to work with the state, right? Believing that like the state inherently is an institution that causes harm. And so if we want to create conditions where harm doesn't exist, we won't operate with the state. Whereas we see with restorative justice a lot, restorative justice works with the justice system. It can work with police. We see it in lots of different levels of working with the state. Troi, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I will acknowledge that I am not a transformative justice expert either. It is not my really bailiwick, but I will piggyback on the fact that restorative justice works anywhere that there are people, and there has been a movement within restorative justice to acknowledge the criticisms that, as I appreciate, the transformative justice movement has levied on restorative justice, that it does not function at a systemic level, but it can function at a systemic level, and it should function at a systemic level. And we are still working to get there. I think there's a lot about restorative justice and transformative justice that really complement and are very much alike in a lot of ways. But I also, I have acknowledged, and the work that we do at the Center for Restorative Approaches acknowledges the systemic issues and works to address those as well. In terms of co-opting, it's difficult. I say that restorative justice has become sexy. It is the term that flies off of everyone's tongue now, even though most people who are using it don't know exactly what it means. They are using it because they believe that others will say, "Oh, you're using restorative justice. This is great. You're on the cutting edge." Our DA in New Orleans, our former DA, said that he was using restorative justice, and he wasn't. What he was doing was plea bargaining. That is what was going on, and it is those kinds of situations that make it really difficult for true restorative justice practitioners who actually adhere to the tenets of restorative justice, i.e., everyone has an equal voice. That the facilitator cannot say, well, if you do this, then you get 10 years off of your sentence. The district attorney can't facilitate a restorative circle. And so the work that we're doing in New Orleans is really trying to pull all of that out of the criminal legal system and put those services, these processes, into the community itself.
I would just love to add to that too. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what restorative justice is. I think people really largely associate it as exclusively a process, right? Like restorative justice is a thing you do where like victims and offenders, which is not language we use in restorative justice, but to shorthand it, sit down together and talk to each other, right? And it is that, right? And it's also so much more. And as we've been talking about, is like it is a whole set of guiding principles and tenets and belief systems, right, about people and about humans and about relationships. And I think a lot of systems, justice system, education system, I don't think the co-optation of it is intentional. I think there's just sometimes confusion about what it is. And so I think really being clear that restorative justice doesn't live and die on circle processes, and that's almost always circle processes can happen, and there's space for them. But if they can't, for whatever reason, we can still use guiding principles of restorative justice to inform all sorts of decision making and interactions. And I think that tends to like help it be more embedded as a paradigm and not just as like a program, if that makes sense.
I'm just thinking about an organization I know out here called Insight Prison Project, and I was lucky enough to do a training with them, and they do collapse victim offender dialogue with restorative justice. Those are the taglines of their program. And, they work with people inside the walls, and they work with most people who are serving life, and their program is 2 years long, and it's extremely intensive and radically transformative. And the rates of recidivism for the folks they've worked with are almost non-existent. And, in that sense, it is an abolitionist strategy because it's very transformative and effective. But that's just an example of, the massive umbrella that RJ is. And it is, entering pop culture. As you say, it's got a sexiness, and that's a beautiful thing, and also, needs some care and tending, I think. So I want to focus our next conversation on call out culture and the rub that can exist between healing that is survivor centered and processes that are supportive of those who have harmed. And I personally have engaged in some restoration practice in the dance community in San Francisco and have been directly accused of supporting abusers. And that is a personal experience that I've had. So before I let you all speak on that, I just want to read something that Adrienne Marie Brown wrote in her most recent book, We Will Not Cancel Us. She says, canceling is punishment, and punishment does not stop the cycle of harm, not long term. Instead of prison bars, we place each other in an overflowing box of untouchables, often with no trial, and strip us of past and future, of the complexity of being gifted and troubled, brilliant and broken. So can you speak to the complexity of repair versus canceling?
Lauren has spoken about the fact that restorative justice or approaches, whichever of those terms that you're using, is really about a mindset, a way of interacting in the world. That's the way we describe it in the training that we do, that it guides through these guiding principles and tenets the way that you interact in the world. And if we are asking for movements that move us in the direction of abolishing prison industrial complex and these punishing systems that we have lived with for hundreds of years, and we are saying, as Brian Stevenson says, no one is only the worst thing that, like, we are more than the worst thing that we have ever done. That is for everybody. That is for everybody. And I understand the feelings. I came from my family, my sister. I have a sister in particular who hates when I say this. She says, Troi, why do you keep saying that? because I lived in a very violent household. And for 17 years of my life. And that is the culture I was raised in. And I say that I am violent by nurture. I was nurtured in a violent, and I fight against that every solitary day. I'm involved in a particular issue right now, and I've been telling my colleagues I am working so hard to be restorative right now. So I understand where it comes from, but if we want a world in which everyone is treated with respect, in which everyone has an equitable opportunity to not only live and thrive, we have to have that equity in all aspects of our life. And this is why I love restorative approaches, even though sometimes it is very difficult for me when I am upset myself, that I hold myself to those standards and I acknowledge when I don't live up to them. And I try very hard to hold myself accountable to them, and others to hold me accountable to them. And that's what this is about. How do we, in fact, focus on the relationships that we are in community, and that when we punish anyone and don't adhere to the tenets that we're asking for people who are in the prison industrial complex, then we are not helping to get there. And that is just the honest truth, at least for me.
Yeah, I love that, Troi. And you had said something in our chat last week about this, about like the framing of
Yeah.
processes and restorative processes, and how so we're all just products of our systems, right? Is like we're born into these socializations and ideas, and then we get to spend our whole lives trying to unlearn some of those things. And so even with folks that are thinking about restorative justice or trying to think about justice differently, sometimes we can still use the same framing of accountability, right? That accountability that our justice system uses, which is that accountability is synonymous with punishment. And it's true. It's like if we're encouraging people to be a part of a process in which accountability is still synonymous with punishment, I don't know that I would want to participate in that, as somebody that maybe caused harm. And so the framing of this is really important. And so, I mean, I would say, like, first of all, for me, like separating the ideas of call out culture and cancel culture, to say that like cancel culture does not exist, is a like concept that a lot of folks in like mainstream society are making to avoid accountability of real harm that has happened. And I think call out culture is a little more like internal to the like liberal or activist community. And so I would just come back again to say is like so much of this work is about doing internal mindset shifts to understand the language that we're using, right? So when we're talking about accountability, what we're saying is like we're trying to distance it from its being synonymous with punishment, to say like accountability is actually nothing more than like an opportunity to make right. It's an opportunity to make right with self, with others, and with community support, right? And also, I think Mia Mingus, who's a transformative justice person in the Bay Area, says something like, what if we made accountability hard but not scary? Like, what would happen if we could shift that? And so I just think those are really important pieces. There was something else. Oh, I also want to just give another RJ, TJ person is Sonia Shaw, who says like, what if we could reframe accountability to just mean like, accountability is nothing more than like this agreement that we're in relationship to one another, and sometimes harm will happen. And that's what accountability is, right? When we're reframing accountability as that, and restorative processes as opportunities to sit down and dialogue with each other, they're really not that scary. I mean, though they can be hard, but really, like, when they're hard, it's also when people are coming together in a hard thing is where like really transformative work happens, like really magical experiences for like huge shifts for people.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, we do have a system where as soon as we say accountability, people, unless you're the one who's asking for it, if you're the one who's asked, I just broke my necklace. If you are the one who's asking for accountability, then accountability is great. If you are the person that the accountability is directed towards, you run away. And this really is about creating communities where accountability is part and parcel with being in that community, because you are responsible for one another, and you're not talking about blame or shame, you're talking about impact. My actions impacted someone. Whether that was intentional or unintentional is really not the point. The point is that there was impact, and you need to make that right if it was harmful in some way. And using that language of, what was the impact of that, getting people to talk about it on that level, and understanding what is necessary, to move them in a more positive direction together in some way. And anyone who is a practitioner has just seen people come into these circles wanting to throw the book at people. They still are in a very punitive mindset. And they get into the circle and they are able to see each other as human beings. And then it changes. We did a process with someone who was accused of sexual assault. And the person was vilified on social media. And it not only impacted him, like his child, and who was 9, ended up in therapy. His wife was traumatized, and there's impact in that too when we don't come together to resolve these issues. Then the harm is expansive. It's expansive, and this really is about finding ways for us to live in community with each other in ways that everyone can thrive.
Yeah, I would love, you just reminded me too, and Jo, you had said, I think kind of to start your question off, spoke to like, I get accused of whatever by still working with this person, and to just name that, like, a main tenet of restorative justice is that we are centering people that have been harmed, and centering their needs as defined by them and not by a prosecutor or a state. And we are putting the person who caused harm directly accountable to those needs with community support, right? So that they can actually be successful in meeting those obligations. And again, I think it ties back to like our internal mindsets about what we think justice is, because it doesn't help anybody when someone has been accused of harm or has caused harm, to isolate them, right? They might need to take a step back from their position or whatever. Like maybe they're not ready to be in the position of power that they're in, but it doesn't help anybody to isolate them. And really, like, it's so helpful to have people that are willing and able, community members that are able to like also support that person to go through the muscle flexing of accountability, right? Accountability is like a skill set. It's not this thing we arrive to. And we as a society, just like those muscles are so atrophied, right? And so having community around us while we build and flex muscles around accountability is necessary.
I love accountability as a skill set, and I love accountability as hard but not scary. So I just wanted to repeat those for our audiences. as I have been organizing the third in my trilogy, one of the things that we plan to do is bring a circle process everywhere we tour the piece. And we are going to be working with Sean Pica, who is the executive director of Hudson Link in New York, which is a university inside the prison systems. And he was inside of Sing Sing for 20 years and is now the executive director of Hudson Link. And I remember telling him, this is, and we've talked about, I hope it happens, we've talked about doing the circle in the chapel in Sing Sing. So this is the only time we're thinking about doing it with folks who are inside, and bringing in folks who have been harmed with those folks and having a day together. And I remember, Sean saying, well, yeah, it's going to be kind of hard. And I said, yeah, we really need to give support to the survivors. He said, yeah, and we really need to give support to the people who are, in prison right now too. So
Right.
I go back and forth in my own consciousness about being thoroughly present for the whole of restorative justice. So those two little phrases you gave are going to help me. So thank you, Lauren. So we are here today because we are being hosted by the CAC, which is an art center.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to ask you, how have you seen or experienced art as a practice of restorative justice? Is that something that you'd like to speak to?
Sure, absolutely. As I said, for me, this is about building, nurturing, and repairing relationships. That if we're really looking to get to the kind of communities that I envision, where everybody is living their whole and best self, then we need to do all of those. So, we are very blessed in New Orleans to have great place. I know Kathy is on the call, so Art Spot works explicitly in the area of using art for social justice, and so does Junebug Productions, and I've worked most with Junebug. And our first work was really with the School of Prison Pipeline. We did most of our work in schools as both an intervention and prevention. Let us keep them in school so they don't get suspended, so they don't end up, getting arrested, and so on and so forth. And through Junebug, we wrote a play called Lockdown. That right after Katrina, we had rates of suspensions as high as 70% in some of our schools. It was astronomical, the rates that they were suspending and expelling children in an effort to keep them disciplined. And we did a play that really told the stories of the young people and the families that had to live through that. And art, I'm preaching to the choir here for all the artists in the audience, is a way to feel and understand and experience a subject matter in a way that, for me, talks about both heart and mind. It gives you somehow a little bit of distance from it, other than reading or being dictated statistics and things like that. But it also allows you to feel the human impact of what it is that you're talking about. And of course, we had talkbacks after the plays in order to help people to understand it. I remember having a conversation with someone who had founded a charter school system who was very angry about the play, thought it was inaccurate, things like that. And it was another one of those moments where, I was really working to be restorative and hear that, even though I did not agree with that, and was able to have him to understand what I just said, that this is a way for people to understand this in a human way and really help to support the school that all of us want. All of us want our children to be safe and happy and get everything that they need to thrive through the school system. So we also at CRA helped to produce a play about my mother-in-law, which was one of the first. She was the first African-American deputy chief and one of the first African-Americans on the police force. And the goal was really to see things from the police perspective and see things from the community perspective, and then have dialogues about that on how do we improve relationships so that we can help to reduce arrests, so we can help to reduce crime in communities, so that that police officers are seen as community members who are there to help, as opposed to being there to support, a supremacist system and be oppressive. So I really think that art forms are necessary in order to help people see these issues in ways that respond to their heart and to their mind and to their feet, so that they can take action to make things better.
I'm gonna just be brief. That when I was like, I don't understand the question and I won't respond to it. But I think listening to Troi, who's such a phenomenal artist around town, I think it just ties really beautifully into the idea that abolition is not actually, it's not about tearing things down, it's about creating something new. And I think art also ties into that. What do you think about that, Jo?
Oh, well, I have hours of conversation to chat about.
Yeah.
Well, I think that just going back to something you said, Troi, about that you were hosting or a part of a circle where the family of this person who caused harm was deeply traumatized by the experience as well. And I have made a piece of art about that very phenomenon where, while there are a lot of women in prison, and the fastest growing statistic of type of person getting into prison or being put in prison is Black women, there are so many more women actually with an incarcerated family member. And so I have chosen to create from that position as a woman with an incarcerated loved one, in partnership with an organization called SE Justice Group, which offers a healing to advocacy model for women with incarcerated loved ones, in that, women with incarcerated loved ones are not to be pitied or shamed, but to be recognized for the power that we have to change the system, because we have lived through its trauma firsthand. So I'm really grateful to the CAC for hearing me out with that, and putting their money where their mouth is, and they're going to be bringing the piece to you all in a few months. So we'll be in your town in September. And I'm also really grateful to an arts institution that has recognized that when you're dealing with social justice, that building relationship between artists and activists, between people working in the artistic realm, in the educational realm, and in the policy realm, it is a full circle, and it is an abolition practice unto itself to bring us together, learn from each other, and amplify each other's strengths. So that's something else that I really believe in. And so I'm grateful to be in conversation with you all today.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add one thing that I thought about as you were talking. For me, the arts it's an empathy builder, right? It builds empathy in people. And that is a direct connection to restorative approaches. Restorative approaches really helps people to see the story with empathy, to see the other person's side of the story, and that humanizes them, right? So I see them as very complementary for many reasons, but that is one of the primary reasons, is that it does build within us empathy in a way that I don't, other than restorative circles, I don't often see that. I don't often see that. I don't see it often enough. Let me say that.
So as we're talking about the weight room coming to New Orleans, can you guys tell me what restorative justice looks like in New Orleans specifically? Maybe one or two things that you're involved in right now?
Sure. The CRA is, we just got the MOU back from the DA's office that will codify a relationship in which the DA's office will be sending referrals for restorative justice diversion pre-charge. So a person has actually been arrested, but before they are charged and end up going into court, we will facilitate restorative circles, and if they participate in the circle and the agreement that is reached in the circle is kept, they will never be charged. So that charge will not be on their record. And in this way, as we've talked about throughout, the reparation really based upon the needs of the survivor, but also the needs of the responsible party, because that is a very important part of the reparation plan, that we're looking at some of the reasons this happened, this offense happened, and how do we help and support that responsible party in moving forward in a different trajectory than the one that leads to a path to prison.
You don't want to say anything about the CRA?
Did I just say, what else?
Yeah, she did.
Well, I just want to highlight like the work that you have done. What is the number you gave about the number of circles you've done?
Oh,
that to me is like, you gotta
oh yeah, we were founded in 2008, and we've done very close to 1,400 circles, with 96% of those circles reaching agreement, and about 90 to 92% of those agreements being kept. I am incredibly proud of that, but I also want to say that those are the statistics that we see all around the world. If people adhere to the guiding principles and the tenets of restorative approaches, those are the kinds of results that we see everywhere. It is when we don't adhere to those tenets and guiding principles, and we throw in some things that we think are going to work, or we want to cut some corners somewhere, or we want a quasi-restorative but mostly punitive way of doing things, that we don't see those kinds of results. So, but thank you, Lauren, for helping me to brag a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just such an amazing number, and y'all just have worked so hard. I would love to give a quick shout out to an upcoming organization that I'm a part of called the Conflict Resolution Institute of Louisiana, or CRIL for short, which is comprised of some local professional mediators and myself as a restorative justice practitioner. And we all started knowing each other around town over the years of just getting like random strangers finding our phone numbers somehow and saying like, I don't know you. I heard you do this thing. I really need some support. I really need some help. And there are incredible local conflict resolution agencies around town. And also I think like, unfortunately, there's enough conflict to go around, if that makes sense. And so, we started just operating, being like, who can take this case, who can do this thing, and just realizing we wanted to put more of a structure to it. And then particularly, when George Floyd was murdered, and we started to have more conversations about like proactive community resources as alternatives to calling the police, we realized or really started to ground in the idea that conflict resolution services could be a really great tool for people, that people would use if they had access to it as proactively as possible. So we just filed for 501c3 status, and we're chugging along, but coming together. And the goal is going to be to provide quality, free conflict resolution services for Louisiana citizens, and be working with any systems that want to not just take referrals, but really look at changing their values and understandings and paradigms of what justice is. So we're very excited about that. And the other thing I would just note is, I think I said in the beginning, is that I'm noticing this happening locally, which is very cool. But I think, as Troi mentioned too, like, there's national trends of this, is that we're really starting to understand or see people take restorative justice and really name it as a social movement, and not just as a philosophy or a process, but really as an umbrella to gather activists and organizers, to like groundswell community support towards these systems, to say like, we want something else, like not in our name anymore. And I'm noticing that a lot in the city. And I think that kind of like ground community support, is what like helps those people empower like our new DA and the CRA, as a community agency to collaborate together. And so that piece is really important, that even if you're not a restorative practitioner, to still be talking to representatives and people in power to say that this is something that is important, makes things go a long way.
So that's an awesome lead in into my concluding question, which is that I think there's a lot of people who might not be donors toward, criminal justice systems change, or might not be so interested in lobbying and legislative work, but might be really interested in getting involved in restorative justice processes. And I know that circles need community members to be a part. So can you just let folks know, either of you or both of you, how people can get involved in restorative justice?
I will gladly go first there. We have a training that's coming up. We are going to be looking for volunteers, both to facilitate restorative circles and to be that community, that advocate, that supporter, that to help a person actually complete that reparation plan. We're also going to be looking for survivors of crimes that might be a surrogate if we get a survivor that for whatever reason does not want to participate in the circle themselves, but does not want the person to go through the criminal legal system. So if a person was robbed, and they don't want to participate in the circle themselves, then having a person who could speak and say, I was robbed and this is what it felt like, would be really important. So we're looking for those kinds of volunteers. The training for the supporters and the facilitators themselves is happening May 21st, I believe. I should have known that right off the top of my head, but it is on our website, on the events tab, at thecra.net, thecra.net. And we are offering scholarships for those people who are willing to volunteer.
Cool. In terms of like restorative justice, I think this is like not very sexy, but I would encourage people to really be thinking about what are the belief systems and paradigms that you hold internally about justice and accountability and healing. Even if, that's it, this is lifelong, as Troi has said, and I would share too, is like, man, my immediate reaction is not always to be restorative, right? I have a lot of internalized belief systems when I feel wronged, or I have caused harm. And so doing that internal work, and like internal investigation, is really important. And then, to some of those RJ adjacent movement folks, we were speaking to earlier, I would just love to give a shout out. I'm not a part of this organization. I guess I should be, to the Orleans Parish Prison Reform Coalition, OPPRC. They're really focusing on making our local jail, Orleans Parish Prison, a more humane jail space, as well as decreasing the size. And they're looking to like shift police funding to, particularly to like alternative crisis response, when getting like calls around mental health. And so I see their work is really aligned with abolition, and with the work that we do, right? It kind of like takes everyone together. And so I would love to give them a shout out.
Yeah, and I would add the People's DA Coalition, which is focused primarily, obviously, on the DA, and is really looking for people to continue to be involved in ensuring that the system that we have envisioned is the system that we get. So it is about holding all elected officials accountable, but again, remembering that accountability is not a bad thing. It's not a shaming thing. It's not a punishment thing. It is, you said this is what's going to happen, and we're going to check to make sure that that's going to happen, and also really support these elected officials who are courageous enough to go against the grain, the ingrainedness of punishment in virtually all of our systems, right? And they are really fighting to ensure that these things are happening, and that takes great courage. So they also need support to continue to do that.
Wow. Awesome. We are going to end our conversation here, and I wish to bathe both of you in incredible energy and sustainability, because I know it's hard, because you all are also going against the grain, and it's hard work. And so I'm so grateful that you're out there doing the work, and are willing to be in dialogue with me as an artist and with the CAC. And to folks who are listening, we hope you will join us for the Weight Room when it comes in September. And several of the activists that we've spoken to over all 9 of these intersectors will be part of the performance project. So we'll have some engagement between audiences and people on the ground like yourselves in New Orleans doing hard work. And thanks again to the CAC staff. And we'll see you next time.